Hello, this is Jyotika. Welcome back to Excelling Psychology. This is a lesson which I've made in a series of videos. So this is part 2 of the lesson. If you haven't watched already, you'll have to watch part 1 first to fully understand this part. Last part, what had happened was my video recorder just crashed abruptly and I didn't come to know. So I had completed the bar graph, but the video, if you see, it has ended only on the completion of the first bar, which I could do. So what I'll do is quickly first I will explain the rest of the bars, how I drew them, and then we will move ahead and do the remaining questions. So in the last video I had explained how we label the axis and how we make the first bar of the ball, and now you can see similarly I have made the remaining bars. For example, if we take the bar of friends, it is 11. 11 is the mean stop distance, so I've just taken it a little above 10 so that it is precise. It is actually looking like 11. As I had mentioned in the last video, you don't have to be very exact, you just have to be approximate. So I have just drawn 11 a little above 10, and you can see the width of the bar is the same as the previous, and the width between the bars also I have maintained. Then you can see that for stranger it was 39, so I have taken it close to 40, and for authority figure it was 34, so I took it in between 40 and 30, roughly closer to 30 definitely. I have labeled all the bars, so you can see that. Don't forget to label the bars. Any mistakes you make here will make you lose marks, because then the examiner won't know which bar is representing which protagonist. Also, after making all the bars, I have done the, actually I think I'd already done the scaling, because then only we're able to draw correctly. So let's just quickly review the scaling. It is from 0 to 40, and what all you have to note to get 4 marks once you complete this answer: you should have your y and x axis labeled, you should have all the bars labeled like I pointed out, and the scale written. Then you get your 4 marks. One more question, in fact, I had answered before the application crashed, and by the time I realized that question is why the bar graph is appropriate graph to plot this data. So you can see the answer is already written. I'll just explain it. Bar graph, when it is appropriate, whenever we are doing any comparison, so it is appropriate for experimental studies in the syllabus. Here we have compared different conditions of the independent variable, that is the 4 protagonists. I have not mentioned that in the answer because it is just for 1 mark. If it was for 2 marks, I would have specified which are the 4 conditions we have compared. So I have just written this as, okay, we have compared different conditions of the independent variable, and that's why we have drawn bar graph. Now, what a common mistake students make in this answer, what I've seen is they will give a very generic answer. Like bar graph we have drawn to visually represent the data. See, they're not asking you why you draw any graph or why you draw graphs in general, because that is a statement you could apply to any graph. Any graph, be it scattergram, bar graph or a histogram, all are representing data visually. So when they've mentioned the word bar, obviously they're looking for specifically why is a bar graph drawn, what is unique or distinctive about it compared to other graphs which are there. So you have to write something about bar graph, not graphs in general. Another mistake I've seen students making is, for the bar graph they would justify it as it becomes useful for quantitative analysis. It is helpful to analyze the data and come to a conclusion, or to see whether the hypothesis is supported. Now that also is very generic. It is something you could say about any graph. Okay, so make sure in bar graphs you talk about comparison. That is the key thing. You can write it in different ways. It doesn't have to be exactly how I've written. You could have some comment on how the heights of the bars are compared, something like that, but comparison is key. Next is there are state one conclusion from the data. So what we've seen looking at the data is people with high empathy maintain greater distance from a stranger than a friend, because we had seen this studies about the high empathy group, the data given here, and we had seen for a stranger they keep a very big distance of 39, whereas for a friend they just keep it to 11. Okay, so conclusion is easy as such. It's only for 1 mark. Again, the mistake students make is to just give the numbers. Conclusion is not results or evidence. It's not a retelling of the numbers. So how students would write is, okay, for the stranger, the mean stop distance was 39 and for the friend it was 11. Conclusion means interpretation of data, or what are you understanding from the data. So now if you just say for this it was 39 and for that it was 11, you're just restating the results which are there on the table. Doesn't show what you've understood from the table. Okay, so don't confuse a conclusion question with a results question. Also, some students would partially write the answer in the sense people prefer greater distance from stranger than a friend. In fact, this people or participants or sample I have seen generally being used in many answers. It is never appropriate. When you say people, which people are you talking about is a very important question. People with high empathy, because otherwise you're making a very generalized statement by saying people prefer more distance from a stranger. It seems like you're talking about universally everybody. That doesn't show good understanding. You will realize in your 10 markers on the paper, there is a clear criterion for good understanding because they've given a table for those answers. So definitely they're telling you explicitly on good understanding you get good marks on that answer, which does not mean that on other answers you don't need to show good understanding. Good understanding is something you need to show on each and every answer which is there in the paper. Okay, so when you say general things like people without being specific or participants, it does not show good understanding. It looks like you're on the spot just reading the table and trying to make something out of it without truly understanding what the table is about and then reading the table. Many times I have mentioned, I'll just quickly specify, in my other videos also I have said, whenever a table is given, first read the name of the table, then read the column headings, then the row headings, and then the data which is given. So that will show good understanding. When you begin from the beginning and then go to the column rows and with respect to what you have read in all those headings, understand what are the numbers given. That will show good understanding. So show that to the examiner. Okay, now this was the point when I realized that the video has stopped recording. So I had not written the answer for this one. Let's do it now. The question given here, it's in continuation of the table. Suggest one ethical strength of using a computerized virtual room to prefer interpersonal distance. Now, this should seem very obvious to you. If they're emphasizing on virtual room, you have to think of the alternative, or you have to think counterfactually. What if they would have not used a virtual room? Then what would have been the weakness? If you think in these terms, it's very simple to think of an answer. If you're not able to, look at the question and realize that this is how you have to think, means you haven't practiced answering questions enough. And like I always say, doing well in the A-level psychology exam is all about answer writing practice and examination practice. So make sure you're not lacking in that. If you're just reading and rereading the textbook, when such a question comes in the paper, your only response will be in your mind, oh, but this was not there in the book. Was there something like this in the book? So that shows how important answer writing practice is. They're going to take the base from the textbook, but all questions are not going to be descriptive or exactly something you can answer by rote learning from the book. Do keep that in mind. Okay, so now coming to one's strength, what if they would have used a real room? Like I said, that's what you have to think about. Some people would have become hesitant in front of others. Like imagine if you were in the study and you had to sit in an actual room, and then you had a stranger or friend or somebody coming near you, and then you had to tell the experimenter when to stop this person. When someone's physically coming close to you, you would have felt uncomfortable at that time. Especially say if you're somebody who does not like people coming close to you. If you're sensitive, like in this study also they've pointed out some people are high and others are low empathy. So someone who doesn't like people coming close to them, it would become a stressful situation for them. I always emphasize on one thing. Whenever it comes to an ethical type of question, you have to mention or specify the exact ethical guideline that you are referring to. So when I say that someone is going to get uncomfortable by others coming close to them, which is the relevant ethical guideline? Protection from harm. Okay, exactly, you should know. Protection from harm. That is how you remember it. So specify this first and then give the explanation in the next point. So one ethical strength is protection from harm. And definitely the explanation after this you can give counterfactually. Had participants been physically exposed to actual people coming close to them, many of them would have experienced distress or discomfort. Okay. Now these were some questions in the initial part of the paper, and you can see now how they have designed paper 2 is to include a lot of core study questions in the beginning. So up to question 4 we have seen core studies. Now we have general research methods questions without reference to core studies, like in the sense there is, but you have to generate the answer. They have not given a stimulus from the core study. And then after this we are going to see completely unseen scenarios. So let's look at question 5 first. Here they have asked define the term population. So in general they want to know what's a population. This is just for 1 mark, so don't end up giving lot of elaboration and examples. So population, as you know, is all the entities that the researcher is interested in studying. Any other definition that you've learned from any of the 3 textbooks, you can write that, or from anywhere, as long as it is correct. So population is the collection of all entities. Why I'm using the term entities? Because it could be anything, objects, institutions, human beings. So I'm not just saying persons or individuals, that a researcher is interested in studying. An alternative definition that you will see in many textbooks is population is a set of people sharing common characteristics. That is also very correct. Okay, next is outline one example of a population from core study from the social approach. Very important is to read social approach. In this type of question where they ask you to give an example of the population, 2 mistakes students make. They go on extremes. Either they make it too broad and they'll say everybody in the world. So in the social approach, as far as I remember, the first study is Milgram. Now what they would say is the results are meant to be applied to everybody in the world. That is way too broad a population, and it seems like a very generic answer. Like no matter which study was there, you could have said everybody in the world. So that's not how you define the population. Population is whomever the researcher has reached out to or has considered in the process of sampling. Another mistake they make is to be very narrow and actually give the sample instead of the population. So in Milgram study, they would say 40 people of various occupations who actually came and gave the shocks in the laboratory. That's the sample. That's not the population. When they say population, it's implicit or it's understood that they are talking about the target population. Okay, so you take it that way. Some textbooks are really good. Like if you see Professor Roberts' textbook, in that they always refer to the population as target population. That makes it even more clear. But even if we don't go by that, just keep this in your mind. Population is whom the researcher has targeted, not just anybody in general. Obviously, a researcher does want his results to apply to anybody in the world. but that's not how we are considering for any specific study what the population is. Now here in some questions you realize they give very fixed templates, like prompts of what you are to write where. Always respect that and write according to that. So first they've given course study, you name the course study there. I'm naming milligram, obedience. And next is where they say example, there you give the example of the population. So don't interchange the two. So example is milligrams population included all individuals from New Haven, Connecticut. Even if you just say New Haven or Connecticut, either one, that is fine, who were reached out to by newspaper advertisement or direct mail solicitation. So the understanding here, I'm just briefly explaining, is that Milgram must have reached out to hundreds or thousands of men through his mails and his advertisement. So those were his target population, and then definitely from amongst those he got 40 for the study. That's the sample. But whom did he consider in the first place? Everybody whom he requested for participation. So that becomes the target population. You'll be able to contrast better since the next question is about sampling. Define the term sample. Okay, here again any good definition that you've learned from any textbook is fine here. Sample, as we know, is a subsection of the population which the researcher actually studies. Okay, so the researcher might wish to study a lot of people who are in the population, but who actually come into his study, they become the sample. So anything that you say to that effect, means which conveys this intent, that will be a correct definition. Like I said, you could learn it from anywhere, wording could be different. Now they've asked the next question similar to the previous one. Outline one example of a sample from course study from social approach. Again, respect the fact that they've asked from social approach. If you give from any other approach because you don't remember from the social approach, you're definitely losing marks, you're not getting any credit at all. It might as well be better to skip this question in that case. In the A levels exams, don't assume you just have to fill the pages or you just have to write something to get marks. Writing something irrelevant does not get you marks. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so now again I'm taking milligram, though it's not compulsory. I just feel it's better, that it looks better to continue from the same, because it conveys that in my mind I have a clear distinction between population and sample. Most students here will ask a question, does it have to be from the same study from which we gave the population? No, it does not have to be. Otherwise they would have phrased the question in that way. So clearly they would have told you, give the example which is similar to A2, I think that was the question, but they haven't. So that means they are willing to take from another study also. So instead of Milgram, if you want to give from 𝗶𝗵𝗬𝗖𝗛 or Perry et al., even that is fine. Okay, so I'm going to name Milgram again. Also you see, again they've asked you for the name for that reason only, because it could be different from the previous example, they know that. Okay, and who is the sample? I've already explained that, so I'm just writing down Milgram's sample included 40 men who actually participated in his experiment. Definitely you can give more details if you want to. It's just unnecessary for 1 mark, so I'm not writing. But if you want to say they were from various occupations like teachers, doctors, and I forgot, engineers, I think, you can mention those things. There's no issue with that. Okay, let's come to the next one. Describe practice effects and fatigue effects using any examples. Many students are very wary of these type of questions, 6 markers. Actually, they're very easy to score because they're very structured. So if you see a 6 marker question, what you have to do is whatever effect they've asked for, like whatever, there'll be 2 concepts that they're asking for. Sometimes they might ask you to contrast them, but here they've not asked for that explicitly. If you want, you can, there's no problem. So 2 concepts are going to be there. Definitely 3 marks for each concept. That's how it gets divided. Means it's very easy to understand the structure. So practice is for 3 marks and fatigue is for 3 marks. Within that also the breakup is easy to understand. Definitely any concept is asked, you're going to be giving the definition. So 1 mark each for definition. Whether you call it definition or I'm explaining the concept, you're doing essentially, you're just explaining what the concept is. So that is for 1 mark. Second mark is to give any elaboration, any further explanation, depends on what the concept is. So there's nothing fixed about this, but you know, like practice fatigue effects reduce the validity of results, you could talk something about that. Or you could just say there are types of order effects that are found in repeated measures, experimental design, something like that. And then of course they've directly asked you for an example, so definitely they must have reserved 1 mark for the example. In fact, many times for the example also, if it's detailed enough, they're willing to credit 2 marks for that. So in that case, only definition and example could give you 3 marks. So definition 1 mark and example 2 marks. But in that, if you want 2 marks for an example, it can't be very limited. Okay, so I'll explain that when I'm writing down. For now, what you can take it is definition, elaboration, example. Again, definition, elaboration, example. So 3 marks plus 3 marks is 6 marks. Let's begin with practice effects. Practice effect is an order effect in which a participant gains practice by performing one condition in an experiment and therefore improves performance in the second condition. I just take a minute to explain something here. It's very important to learn your research methods concepts very well, because there are many students who don't score well on this answer because they don't mention the key thing. What does practice effect do? Why is it a concern? Because it improves performance. Nowhere in the answer it will be mentioned improve performance. They simply end it at the participant gains practice, or participant learns how to do the task, or the participant becomes less anxious with time. But what is the effect? It's an effect. It's some outcome, some consequence must be there because of it, which is why it's important. You can't miss the key thing in a concept. And how will you know what is the key thing in the concept? If you learn your research methods unit well. If you take it lightly, you're not able to answer these type of questions well. So just, students pick up those notes from the internet where they just give very brief summaries of research methods in bullet points. So 1 line will be there for practice effects, or 2 words for fatigue effects. They just learn that and they feel they know the whole of research methods. This is when you will realize that you don't know it well. When you'll have to write an answer like this, and you won't have anything much to write, so you'll write a short answer like 2-3 lines and in total, and then you will wonder, will I score anything for this? And you feel hesitant because you didn't learn well in the first place. Learn your research methods very well and don't give them less importance than course studies. They are equally important. Both paper 1 and 2 are equally important, which means you cannot neglect research methods in favor of course studies. Okay, now I'll give an example of a practice effect. So for example, in an experiment on the effect of caffeine on I'm taking the textbook example here, though it's not a course study example. See, if they wanted a course study example, here they would have mentioned from any course study. They haven't, means you can give your own example. If you want, you can give from course study. 𝗵𝗫𝗬𝗧𝗏 et al. Is repeated measures and 𝗵𝗫𝗬𝗧𝗏 et al. Is repeated measures. It's just that even in fact in Android, the memory task is repeated measures. It's just that so much clarity is not there on practice and fatigue effects. It's more focused on counterbalancing because they've maintained counterbalancing well in those studies. So I'm not taking that. I'm taking a general example because it will illustrate my point better. But if the question was on counterbalancing, I would have taken an example from Android. Okay, so here I'm taking the general example which is then the textbook for research methods. So for example, in an experiment on the effect of caffeine on reaction time, participants may have to do the task after drinking water first, and then after drinking coffee. They might show improved performance, or we can say improved reaction time to make it more contextualized, after drinking coffee because of practice of the task and not the influence of coffee. Now here I don't need to give any elaboration because in the example itself, if you see, I have elaborated. I have pointed out how it is a confounding problem, practice effect, because I have mentioned that they are not doing better because of drinking coffee or because of the manipulation. They are doing better because of the practice which they have gained. So in my example only I have included the elaboration, or it's inherent in the example, so I don't need to give it separately. But how some students will give an example is, participants will do better under coffee and not water. Why? What happened? I mean, what is making them do better? You have to explain that properly. So if your example is very limited, or you just one more thing I'll point out. First, I'll just say if your example is very limited, in that case, it's not elaborate enough. So it will just count for a second mark, not for a third mark. Some students, I don't know how they have this tendency, their examples are not concrete at all. So where they are learning that, I don't know. But example will be a repetition of the definition. So for example, they would write, if participants have to do two conditions in the experiment and they do the second condition better because of practice compared to the first, then it is practice effect. That's right. But how is it different from the definition? How is it an example? Why is no scenario taken as an example of an experiment? Why is some IV and DV not specifically named? Like in my case, the IV is coffee and the DV is reaction time. Why no specific or concrete example is given of those things? Why is it just again generally talking about IV and DV? So example is example. It has to have some concrete illustration in it. Like, okay, this could be an experiment. This is what could happen in this experiment. Example cannot be the same thing which is already given before. Okay, so make sure your example is actually an example. Let's come to fatigue effect. Similarly, we have to write, so fatigue effect is an order effect in which a participant's performance declines again. Performance declines is the main thing while performing a second condition because of tiredness after performing the first. Here I have given my definition a little less elaborately than that of practice effect because it is related. I'm still talking about repeated measures and people having to do two conditions. I don't need to repetitively mention that. That's understood. I say it's an order effect again means it's understood it's going to be in that type of experiment only. So definitely your points can be connected to the previous. Many students will target that the length should be the same. How many words or how many sentences I've written for practice effect, that much only I have to write for fatigue effect. Always in answers, don't be so preoccupied all the time with length and words, and these things are very, very trivial. Always be focused on giving your content well and showing good understanding, like I mentioned before. Don't get distracted by superficialities of writing. You're learning psychology, you're learning content. You're not learning, I don't know what to call it, tactics of writing the paper or tricks and some kind of thing. Like, you're not learning how to mechanistically keep on counting words and writing. That's not your objective of learning psychology. So keep the larger picture in mind and make sure you're showing good understanding rather than being busy counting the words and the length of what you're writing. So similarly for fatigue effect, you can see performance decline is very important to mention. Just like their improved performance is important to mention because, like I said, these are effects. They are affecting the results of the experiment. That should be obvious when we write about them. So for example, in the experiment outlined earlier, so you can see I don't need to write about the experiment again. I've already pointed out some participants might show worse reaction time after drinking coffee because they would be tired of already having done the reaction time task first and not because of influence of coffee. So again, you can see my example is elaborate enough, so I don't need to explain anything further. Elaboration is inherent in the example. Structure is same like I've given for practice effect. Many students will come up again because, like I said, they're very distracted with how many words and length and all. So they'll come up with things like lines are being exceeded in writing. That's absolutely fine. Secondly, I'm writing on the screen directly. It's different from writing in the paper. The dimensions of your paper which come are very different from the dimensions on my screen. Okay, so don't bother about I'm exceeding the lines or anything. Try to understand the content. Try to understand the structure and organization I'm explaining. Always be focused on that if you want to score well. If you're going to be busy looking at superficial things, you will not be able to score well in the paper. Okay, this is part 2. I don't have more time to complete all the questions today. I wanted to do a little more, but I'm not having time. So I'll make a part 3 in which I'll continue with the unseen scenario type of questions. Today I'm ending the video here. Thank you for watching.